Good morning, everyone. I'm Charlotte Morganti. I'm the past president of Sisters in Crime Canada West, which is one of the two Canadian chapters of the International Sisters in Crime organization. Members of Sisters in Crime include writers, readers, agents, publishers, and many more, all of whom love crime fiction and nonfiction. The Canada West chapter is a vibrant and collegial group well worth joining. That's a little hint in case you didn't pick up on it. Before I introduce your host and moderator today, just a couple housekeeping things. Please post your questions for our guests in the Q&A, the buttons at the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. Karen Dodd, our president, and Liz Bass, our secretary, will be watching the chat, but we can't guarantee that they will find your question if that's where you put it. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to our special event, Private Investigators, Being Them, Writing Them. Let me introduce our moderator, Sam Wiebe. I'm sure everyone here has a short list of authors whose books they buy without even reading the back cover blurb, because we know that book is guaranteed to be great. My list has 3 names on it, and Sam's is one. Sam Wiebe is the award-winning author of the Wakeland novels, one of the most authentic and acclaimed detective series in Canada. It includes The Invisible Dead, Cut You Down, and Helen Gone, which, by the way, has recently been nominated by Crime Writers of Canada for the Howard Engel Award for Best Crime Novel Set in Canada. Sam also has a couple standalones and edited the Vancouver Noir anthology. His work has won the Crime Writers of Canada Award and the Kobo Emerging Writers Prize, and has been shortlisted for the Edgar, Hammett, Seamus, and the City of Vancouver Book Prizes. And another huge thing, Cineplex has recently agreed to film the Wakeland series. Sam, welcome. Thank you in advance. I'll let you introduce your panelists and get the show on the road.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And thanks to our panelists for being here, our audience, which is slowly coming in. I am a huge fan of private eyes in fiction, in film. That's why I write what I write. It is very hard to write authentically about private investigation because there is a century-long history of private eyes in film and TV and books, which is very different from what the real thing is about. Most private eyes, and I will let our panel talk about this in more detail, don't get hit over the head every week. Most private eyes don't wear beltless trench coats in sunny Alberta or Vancouver. Most private eyes don't work on homicides in the same way that they do in fiction. So we're dealing with 2 very different things: the history of private eye fiction and then what private eyes actually do. And to speak to that, we've got 2 excellent experts here. Colin Worth started Cornerstone Protection Agency in 2007, following a 27-year career with the RCMP. At the time, he really had no expectation of starting a new career, as he didn't feel the need to work, and then the Olympics came along and he got busy. Colin was the security advisor to the Alberta government, and that rolled into doing security work and investigations for firms in Alberta. And as oil and gas prices dropped in Alberta and his reputation grew, he started getting work in BC. Please welcome Colin Worth to the show.
Hi, everyone.
Our second panelist is Shoshana S.M. Freedman, who studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York and spent years as a private investigator on the not-so-mean streets of Vancouver before returning to her first love, writing. She is the author of the Faithful series, which won Best Debut of 2015 by Suspense Magazine, The Day She Died, and Blood Atonement, which will be available from Dundurn Press in October 2022. It tells the story of a woman who, when other fundamentalist Mormon church escapees are killed, must determine if her alter personality is the murderer or if she's the next victim. That's a pretty darn good cliffhanger. You can learn more about SM Freedman at her website, smfreedman.com. Please welcome Shoshana to our show. I think what I'd like to start with is to hear a little bit about your background as a PI, how you got into the private investigation business, and what your early years were like. Colin, would you like to start off, please?
I'd love to, but and isn't it ladies first on a Sisters in Crime thing?
Sure. Shoshana?
Throwing me under the bus early. I like that.
Absolutely.
So I actually, I left my theater program in New York and I came back to Vancouver where I grew up, and I didn't know what to do with my life. And I was in my early 20s, and I kind of actually fell into the PI world backwards, as I tend to do with most of the best things in my life. And I spent about almost 10 years as a PI, most of my 20s. I ended up working for a firm that was run by an ex-RCMP officer, Fred Bodnarek. I can now name the PI agency because they've changed so much. They don't have the same name anymore. They were called FBI for short. So it was really fun for me to say I worked for the FBI. I did mainly surveillance and other light investigative work. I worked with mainly ex-police and RCMP. And so I ended up being used as a surveillance person most of the time because nobody suspected me of anything. So I could kind of get in just about anywhere. And I looked innocent and young, and nobody, I'd have my purse camera or whatever, and nobody ever thought a thing of it. So that's what I did. And I was in that job for almost a decade before I moved on to other things.
Awesome. And Colin?
Yeah, thanks. And Shoshana, we probably should have asked that question off camera earlier because I worked for Fred.
Oh, did you?
My first year as a policeman, he had just or was just retiring, and we had lots of mutual friends in common, and we can explore that later. Thanks very much for that very warm introduction, Sam. And as you said in the introduction, I sort of fell backwards into doing the private investigative work. I left the RCMP after 27 years. As everyone has seen through headlines over the last 10 or 15 years, the RCMP has taken a pretty rough ride in terms of leadership and the direction and things like that. So it was time for me to leave, and I was single at the time. I had me and my dog and the two of us, and that's all we had to worry about. So the idea of being able to do some traveling and not have any responsibilities was very appealing that day. I also, there was a little angel sitting on my shoulder that said, hey, if you need to go back to work, what do you know how to do? And that was investigations. And so here in the province of British Columbia, you have to be licensed to do private investigations. So I explored that. It was pretty straightforward. The hiccup for me was you needed to work for a licensed firm. And I'd had enough of working for leaders that didn't really know, in my opinion, didn't know what they were doing. So I thought the next idiot that I worked for, I'd actually look at in the mirror every morning. So I explored that possibility, and it was, although it was some red tape and some bureaucracy, it was pretty straightforward to incorporate Cornerstone Protection Agency and get that firm licensed as well. So that's really, that's how I got started. It ended up 2 files in the bottom of my file drawer in the spring of 2007. And then I didn't do anything. I skied and I volunteered and I did a whole bunch of things that were away from police work and decompressed from the stuff that was going on for me at the time. And then 2 things happened. I met the lady that became my wife sometime later. and someone asked me to do some event planning for the Olympics, the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. And out of that, one of our clients in the event planning thing was the Alberta government. And they came to me about a year out and said, "Are you a retired policeman? We heard you're a retired policeman." And I said, "Yes, I am." And they couldn't find anybody to do security consulting, do their security planning for them. They had a number of sites here in town and in Whistler. And they said, "Would you do it?" And that really got me started. And I said, "Sure, my company can do it." And I took that on in addition to the event planning. So the year leading up to the Olympics was crazy busy for me. Ended up hiring some guys, and we got started. And it's just sort of evolved from there.
That's terrific. Why don't we talk about a specific case or an experience that you've each had? I mean, I think the audience would love it if you could take us through a case from your storied careers. Shoshana, would you like to go first?
Should I throw Colin under the bus now?
Sure, go ahead.
You know what? I suspect his story is going to be a lot more interesting. So I'm going to tell mine first because it's just a little moment in time where I thought I was going to die. And I think I may have already told you this story, Sam. So I apologize for repeating myself. But I was, like I said, I did a lot of surveillance, and most of the time you weren't watching people who were too dangerous. They were more, cheaters or cheating insurance companies or what have you, WCB. But in this case, it was actually, I believe, a WCB case, but the individual we were watching was suspected to have ties to the Hells Angels. And so we were being extra cautious, and the whole company was, switching off individual surveillance people over and over, and everybody kept getting burned, which is our term for made or whatever. You can't be working that file anymore. You're going to get in trouble. So everybody kept getting burned, and I was nearing the end. I was almost the only person left, and I was really inexperienced. It was within my first year or two of doing the job. And I was in my early 20s, and I was the only person who was kind of still safe to go in and do surveillance. So I was doing it, and everything was fine. Nothing much had happened that day. And I left the job, and I was on my way home, and I went through the tunnel, the Cassiar tunnel. And I'm driving home, and I'm not really thinking about much anymore other than getting home, making dinner, what have you. And as I'm entering the tunnel, I hear this enormous roar behind me. And I look up into my rearview mirror, and there's motorcyclists surrounding me, just like this group of like 20 or 30 people, men on motorbikes, big, burly men on motorbikes, kind of coming around me. And it is loud when you're in a tunnel like that and you've got their engines. It was so loud. I almost drove straight into the end of the tunnel, just out of complete terror that I was about to be surrounded and killed. Of course, it was absolutely nothing to do with me. They kept going, and I went home shaking like this, and seriously reconsidered whether I wanted to do that particular job anymore.
Oh, that's terrific. Colin.
Terrific that you're scared to death. Yes, that's wonderful.
It's a terrific scene. Probably not great to live through, but as a story.
It wasn't enjoyable at the time, no.
Yeah. I think, and so for people sort of quick background, I was involved in a case this fall, and that is how I got recommended to this panel, was as a result of the case, I think. And I'm a member of the RCMP that you guys had on last year to talk to the group. So there's sort of two parts. There's what happened up until my involvement, and then afterwards. And so the first part of this involvement is a mom and daughter. Mom's probably in her early 60s, daughter's 32. The daughter is wanting to be an internet or Instagram influencer. So is sort of out there. She's out there posting pictures and on the beach and in a bikini and doing all that sort of stuff. At any rate, she attracts the attention of her landlord. She lives in a building downtown. She attracts the attention of a single older gentleman who's her landlord, who begins to stalk her. And stalks her in a number of inappropriate ways, to the point where she finally phones Vancouver City Police, and Vancouver City Police start an investigation. The owner of the building, the company that owns the building, hears about the complaint and the concern, and immediately fires the building manager. And that elicits a response from the building manager, where the 32-year-old daughter wakes up the next day and finds about $5,500 worth of damage to her car in the parked underground, the locked underground of the building. So a couple of more things happen. Vancouver City Police have been investigating. They've been talking to the building manager, who now is no longer the building manager, is now off site, but they've been talking to him, and things are ramping up, because as they talk to him and they focus their attention on him, he gets angrier and starts to do other things, to the point where Vancouver City Police say to her, you really need to leave the apartment for a while. We're concerned about what's going on, and it would be really helpful if you just left for a couple of weeks. So she moves home to her mom's residence on the North Shore in North Vancouver. And mom's home is a residential area in a relatively well-to-do neighborhood here on the North Shore. It's a single family residence. She's there for 3 or 4 days before a friend says to her, hey, I'm going away for the summer. Can you come and house sit for me? So the daughter leaves. 3 days after the daughter leaves, mom is awakened at she's just gone to bed. It's 11:30 at night, and she's awakened by the smell of smoke. She opens her bedroom door, and the whole front of her house is on fire. So there's somebody has gone to the front door and poured a 5-gallon can of gasoline through the whole front alcove and up and down the front door and lit it on fire. There's $150,000 worth of arson committed to this residence. The RCMP are called and investigate, and they find from a neighbor's security camera, they find this gentleman getting out of a cab 2 doors down at 1 o'clock in the morning, 11:30 at night, whatever the time was. And so the building manager is clearly the suspect for this. 2 days later, because the front of the house is now burnt and it's wide open to the elements, the insurance company has hired a security guard and a security guard to sit in the front driveway until the building's secured. 2 nights later, he has fallen asleep. The security guard's fallen asleep in his driver's seat, but wakes up to the noise because the building manager has now shown up and is pouring 5 pounds worth of sugar into his gas tank. So is able to grab onto this guy. This guy's not smart. He's focused, but he's not smart. So between the RCMP and the Vancouver City Police, they have this conversation. Obviously, this building manager is arrested and he's sitting in jail. So I don't know any of this until a client of mine who, and these mom and daughter own an exclusive clothing store downtown Vancouver. So one of my clients reaches out and said, I was in to buy some clothes. I know this lady on that sort of personal friendship basis. I've been there for years, a client for years, and she's freaked out. She's really concerned. Can you go and talk to her? Can you just tell her what's happening next? And this guy's in jail, but can you just spend a few minutes with her? So I do. I go and talk to mom and daughter, and I visit them in both of their residences because daughter's now moved back into her apartment. The guy's in jail. There's no issue. Everything's fine. But here are the things you need to do. And yes, I'll reach out to the prosecutor and just make sure that things are being done the way they should, because mom and daughter are really freaked out. And from my experience, this guy is very focused, and it doesn't matter that he's in jail. When he does get out of jail, and he will get out of jail, then we need to be aware, and the police departments need to be aware. So I follow up with the RCMP and I follow up with Vancouver City Police. And it helps that I'm a retired member because I can phone and say, hey, I used to do this job. I'm now working for these people. Can you just help reassure us all that you guys are focused on this and this guy's not going to end up killing somebody? So I do all that. I talk to the prosecutor and everything's done. So on a particular Monday in the fall, he is set to be released. The bad guy is set to be released. And there are a number of conditions around being released in British Columbia. One of them is he's got to wear an ankle bracelet so we can monitor him electronically. Number two, he's got to reside in Surrey at a halfway house because he has no income. He has no job anymore. He's indigent, so he's got to have a place to live. So we're going to send him to Surrey. And he's under orders for the court not to appear anywhere near within 500 meters of either of these ladies. He's not to physically go to the city of Vancouver except for court, and he's not to be on the North Shore. So that's Monday night. Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock, I get a phone call from the ladies who say, here's what's transpired this morning, Colin, that you don't know about. First of all, at 10 o'clock when the store opened up, the daughter received a bouquet of flowers with a love note from the manager. Freaked her out. She picked up the phone, phoned the florist. The florist describes the manager to a T. This is the guy that was in here 20 minutes ago, and all we did was deliver flowers. So again, from my advice to them, she immediately called 911 at 10 o'clock in the morning. She talked to Vancouver City Police. She told them she had the file number. She had all those things ready. All of that stuff took place. Vancouver City Police arrive. They physically come to the store. They talk to her. They're in the neighborhood. They're in and out of the store, and they're around the store for basically the rest of the day. At 4 o'clock, the daughter goes, geez, we haven't talked to Colin. We haven't told him what's going on. So she phones me at 4 o'clock, and I'm on the North Shore, and she says, here's what's taken place. Well, I was able to directly phone the investigator and find out that, in fact, on Monday afternoon when he was released, he was picked up by the halfway house, but he never got an electronic monitor. He never got his ankle bracelet put on. He was driven to Surrey. He said to the guy that picked him up, hey, I just need to use the washroom. And of course, that guy stopped to do some paperwork, and he walked down the hallway towards the washroom and kept on going out the back door and has never been seen. So he didn't spend the night at the halfway house. Oh, actually, the one last thing I sort of forgot about is in the morning, shortly after she called 911, she saw him walk by the front of the store. And in that previous piece, we'd installed an electronic lock on the door. So there was a buzzer at the cash register area that allowed, that stopped people from coming into this store unless there was a buzzer that allowed them in. So I knew they were safe, certainly from an immediate assault. So I found all these details from the investigator. I said to the daughter, I said, I'll see you in half an hour. And she said, no, you don't need to come down. He hasn't shown up all day. And the Vancouver City Police have been here, and I'm sure he's gone. I said, I'll see you in half an hour. She's like, no, it's okay. And I said, I'll see you in half an hour. So as I'm driving down, I was able to pick up the phone and phone the prosecutor directly, say, here's what's gone on. Did you know this? The prosecutor had no idea. I said, well, you should start writing up the warrant for this guy's arrest because we're going to arrest him tonight. And his response to me was, really? I said, yes. He said, you sound pretty confident. And I said, here's what's going on. This guy is focused. My experience tells me that he's focused on his victim. He's focused about having contact with her, and he is not going to go away. And we're going to find him tonight. So start writing up the warrant because we're going to have him in our custody fairly shortly. I get to the store. I parked a block and a half away. I walk into the store like I'm a customer. I said, here's what I want you guys to do. When he shows back up, here's my cell number. Dial it now. So all you've got to do is hit redial. Don't call 911. Call me first. I'll call 911 and we'll deal with it then. So that's exactly what happened. He showed up half an hour after the last Vancouver City policeman had disappeared. And he showed up to see, you know, it was, now we're at the end of the day, it's 10 to 5. And he showed up to see whether they were closing at 5 o'clock and whether they were going to leave the store at 5 o'clock. And she was able to speed dial me. I was able to follow him for the next 15 minutes. I called 911 and said, here's what's going on. This is the name of the guy. This is the file that you've had. I followed him. He has no idea that he was being followed. It's Tuesday afternoon in downtown Vancouver at 5 o'clock. So there's lots of foot traffic. There's lots of vehicle traffic. It was not a big deal to stand behind him 50 or 60 feet and just follow him until Vancouver City Police were able to arrest him. So that's, he's in custody today. That was from November. He's still in custody today. We're expecting that he will be going to trial sometime in the next 30 days. But who knows? So there you are. That was the latest one.
Thank you so much, Colin, for sharing that. That is a story worthy of an S.M. Freedman suspense novel.
I'm taking notes.
I have a few questions about the differences between real life and the fictional PI, but we're starting to get questions in on the Zoom chat and in our Q&A, and I would love to see more of them. I've also got a list that Charlotte has forwarded me of some real nuts and bolts PI stuff. So why don't we get into that, and then we'll save the fictional stuff for after. So the first one here is from Winona, and this is for Shoshana. Do you consider yourself to have a special kind of personality that enabled you to be a private investigator? I could never imagine myself as being one because I'm too timid. Do you have a fearless gene?
Not at all. In fact, anybody who knows me well, my family would say, no, I pretty much live my life with lots of fear in every way. And actually, that's why what I write is I tend to write the things I fear and turn them into something that is maybe, you know, releasing that fear out into the world so readers can deal with it instead of me. But I think what I had in this case that actually worked really well for me was my acting background. I'm actually quite an introvert in my own life, but I can kind of flip a switch and I have that training, that acting training, to be able to become somebody else, to be able to even kind of fade into the shadows if needed, and to truly believe that I am whoever I am in those moments. And so I think actually that's what benefited me in the investigations that I did. It also allowed me to kind of really deep dive into research and understanding people and how people might be thinking, and what their motives might be. And that's kind of what I used to fall back on for the job.
Nice. Colin, would you like to add anything to the personality of that's drawn to private investigation?
Yeah, you know, for me, it was the lack of, like the case I just talked about. It was me that made the decision to drop what I was doing and go downtown. If I was working for the RCMP, even if I was investigating that arson, I couldn't have just at that moment said, oh, I'm leaving whatever I'm doing for the RCMP in North Vancouver today and following up on what this, because I know this is important. I couldn't have done that. My role wouldn't have allowed me to do that. And so I think that that's the biggest draw for me about being a PI is I get to decide what I'm going to do today. And I get to decide what I'm going to do this minute. And so if something emergent arises, then I get to drop whatever and do and follow that up. I also think, you know, Shoshana and I are probably similar in that if I wasn't an actor prior to joining the police force, you become one. Absolutely. There's a role for you to play. And in the moment you play whatever role is necessary. And so I think that experience with the RCMP has certainly stood me in good stead going forward.
Nice. There are a lot of questions about licensing, and Crystal has a great question about the internship period when you're starting out. I'll just throw this out to the panel in general, and either of you can speak to this, but could you talk about the training and the licensing and internship for becoming a PI?
I can talk about it going, now this is of course back a couple decades, so I'm not entirely sure what may have changed, but I can tell you what was going on a couple decades ago when I joined, because I was really starting from scratch, no prior experience, no, police training, no RCMP. And so at that time, you became a licensed investigator, but your license was stamped under supervision. And you had to be under supervision for 2 years before you could go for your full license. And that meant that every job I did, I was working with a partner who was meant to be training me. I did training on the side as well, different courses, different things that my company put me to. I believe there's actually more school training that's required now than at that time. At that time, it was really up to the company that had seen enough in you to actually hire you to train you properly. And so that's kind of what I did. I had to amass a certain amount of hours, which was basically 2 years of investigative work under supervision. And then I was able to go for my full license and be considered a full PI, at which point I could work cases on my own as well, and I had my own full caseload.
Nice. And any interesting stories from the internship period or the supervisory period?
Well, I actually, it's been so long now, I feel like I can talk more honestly about it. I actually had a horrible partner that I worked with in the first year or so, who was actually quite abusive. And I was young and trying to do a good job, and that didn't put me in a position of power to try and navigate. And once the company actually realized what was going on and how bad the situation was, they didn't fire him, but they did switch me over to a different partner. And I ended up with the only other female investigator in the company. And we were like Cagney and Lacey. It was fantastic. So I spent the rest of the time that I had in the under supervision category, learning from this woman who had been a PI in Saskatchewan and then had moved to Vancouver and was doing it there. And she's still a very dear friend to this day. So.
Oh, that's I mean, I'm sorry to hear about the experience, but it's nice that you formed the friendship with a fellow female PI. Very cool. Colin, I have a question here. What's it like to work with the RCMP, and what roles would you take? Not quite a PI question, but since that's such a common background for private investigators, could you speak to what it was like to work with the RCMP?
Yeah, it's was it Shakespeare that said it's the best of times, the worst of times?
Dickens, yes.
Dickens, thank you. Sorry, wrong quote. It was fantastic. Look at it. You know, I early in my life, I was probably 13 or 14 years old when I thought policing was something that I wanted to do. I had the opportunity to get to know some police officers prior to actually joining. I went off to university in Edmonton and was able then to spend some time with Sherwood Park RCMP. I went out and volunteered and ended up having a job as a jail guard, a part-time jail guard. So rather than Friday nights drinking beer or studying, I would spend it looking after drunks in the local jail cell. So I always wanted to be a member of the RCMP, and further to that, I have always worked sort of, I'd call it the pointy end of the stick. So I always wanted to be where the action was. So I was in uniform for a number of years. I was on our emergency response team for 15 years. I was on our tactical team for a couple of years. I was able to get VIP training, which allowed me then to be on every Royal tour from 1986 through to the end of my career in 2007. So I was always where the action was happening. Maybe I was an adrenaline junkie, I think is the right term. And so there was all of those wonderful, wonderful things and wonderful experiences at the end of the day, the very best part. So a quick story. I'm 17 years old. I'm in high school out in Tsawwassen, and the Delta Police have been involved in some really horrible stuff with the youth in the community back in 1975. But the deputy chief is the father of a buddy that I play rugby with at high school. And we're talking about it one day at his house, and his dad's there and says, well, what do you do? And I said, well, why don't we do a ride along program? Why don't you get police officers to spend time with kids? And in 75, when no one was worried about vicarious liability and all of those horrible things about, what happens when you put a 16-year-old kid in a police car in the front seat rather than the back seat, we made it happen. And we made it happen. And half a dozen of us from our high school spent time riding around with Delta Police in 1976. And that's probably the other piece that just made me fall in love with police work. So it's 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm still in the passenger seat. I'm driving, and I'll remember this day for the rest of my life. I'm driving down the highway with the Delta Police guy who's really become my mentor. And I said to him, so what's the best part of the job? I asked him, what's the worst part of the job? And he said, the people. And I said, like drug addicts and thieves and crooks. And he said, no. You expect it from those people. That's what the life. He says the worst part is the bosses, the guys that don't know what they're doing, and they've been pushing a desk for 10 years, and now they're trying to tell you how to police work. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I get that. Bad bosses, 17 years old. I can figure that one out. I said, so what's the best part of the job? And he said, the people. And I'm like, or the worst part of the job? And he goes, the people. And I'm like, okay. Anyways, we was talking about exactly the same thing. So the best part and the worst part were the people. And so I've formed lifelong friendships in the police force from guys that had a similar attitude and that were there to make a difference. And, and for everybody, as hard a time as policing's taken in the last 10 years in North America, or 20 years in North America, when I became a boss and had the opportunity to interview guys just starting, men and women just starting the job, and I'd say, so, why policing? It always came down to essentially one sentence, and that was, I wanted to make a difference for my community. And on lots of levels, the policeman that's responding to the 911 call is making a difference to the community. I got a little jaded and twisted as I got to 27 years service and thought I wasn't really making an impact the way I wanted to anymore, and it was time to leave. But there's lots and lots of good policemen out there, and it was a wonderful time. And I left because of the other stuff. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Long-winded, sorry.
No, it's great, and it really speaks to that mindset that was asked about. There are quite a few questions about the bread and butter of private investigative work. What are the kinds of, the most common kinds of cases? What kind of databases do you use, or technology? And of course, we all want to hear about guns. So do you have a gun? When would you carry it? Shoshana, would you like to answer that first?
So the gun, no, did not have a gun, did not carry a gun. None of the other investigators that I worked with carried a gun either. And most of those were retired police or RCMP. Nobody carried a gun. I think some of the men kind of fashioned, weapons that they kept in their surveillance vehicles just in case. I never did that either. But most of the work that I did as in surveillance mainly was insurance fraud. So it was ICBC, although I know ICBC now going to no fault. I'm not sure how that might have changed. I suspect the bread and butter of ICBC is not kind of dishing out to private investigators quite as much as it used to, but it was ICBC, WCV, Great West Life, lots of bodily injury claims where you'd basically be going and you'd be sitting in front of somebody's house and trying to follow them to wherever they were going and do whatever they were doing in their day, taking video when they were out in public, to try and give your client, which was usually an adjuster, insurance adjuster, an idea of if they were injured the way that they were actually saying that they were injured. And a lot of the times, I'm not sure what the end result of that would be. And then we did, you know, some private stuff, you know, the spousal cheating things, which I always really hated, because there was just no good outcome, whether you caught them or whether you didn't catch them. Nobody won in that situation. And usually with the spousal things, it was your client was somebody who was highly emotional, obviously, very suspicious of their spouse, and also didn't have a lot of money to spend on the investigation. So if they had 10 hours worth of investigative work that they could pay for before they were tapped out, well, you could use that 10 hours and you might have gotten something. And that, you know, gives them some maybe closure or ability to move on with their lives. But then if you didn't catch them doing anything in those 10 hours, it's like, well, they didn't do anything in this 10-hour period of time that we were able to work. There was no winner. So that those were generally the kind of jobs that we did. And then of course there was always the background work of writing up your reports. You had to be very neutral in everything you said in your reports. No opinions. It was just neutral what you observed. You were just kind of like a camera lens in a way. And preparing for court, because you did have to testify in court sometimes. And the things you were testifying in court on were usually things you investigated 2 or 3 years prior. I mean, I was years out of the PI game and still going to court to testify for things that I'm like, I don't even remember this anymore. Thank goodness I have notes, but it's like, I don't know. I don't remember this guy at all. And you'd have to kind of refresh your mind and go in and testify. So.
Thank you. Colin, would you like to add to that? And also any databases or technology that you were that you focused on in your work?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, and I would just further on to Shoshona's comments. I think it really comes down to us being a paid witness. So someone hires us to observe, and lots of this is just observation. And I'd also agree with her on the matrimonial stuff, that if I can get out of doing that, as I say to the lawyers, if you're at the point now where you're trying to catch someone do something, there's already a breakdown of trust. So why are you spending money hiring me that may or may not be successful? Because if I, as Shoshona points out, you're going to pay me for 10 hours and I may or may not, that might not be the 10 hours that anyone's doing anything wrong or immoral. And so convince your client that a paid witness of your spouse's indiscretions is not really what the best way to spend money. And I have that conversation once a month because I hate that work, and I'll do everything I can to avoid it. Flipping back to the others, I used both of these are personal friends of mine. They're one is a retired policeman. He went off to start e-forensic, e-forensic.ca. Both Laurie Windover and Colin Cree are the principals of that organization. And Laurie Windover actually started the computer forensic section for the RCMP back in the 90s. So he was the RCMP liaison at the time to Interpol and to the FBI and whatever other three-letter organizations wanted to have a computer expert back in the 90s. They do computer forensics. And so I use them regularly. There's so much data. We all keep stuff on our computers, and particularly in civil cases, lawyers are very much aware and awake to the idea that if you're trying to falsify information, if you're trying to do stuff, your computer actually will leave a trace of everything and when it happened. And so I use eForensics lots when it comes to collecting that kind of data, and that's generally with a court order and as a result of a law firm doing something. The flip side of that is occasionally a spouse will want to see what's on her spouse's computer, and we can do that, but it's expensive, and you've got to have a fairly healthy bank account in order to do that. The other one I have spent some time learning from is a guy by the name of David Toddington. and I've forgotten the name of his website, Toddington and Associates. But David does, he does all his research online. And so we all leave ourselves a footprint when we're on the computer, and from, you know, whether it's from Facebook and Instagram, all the way to stuff that's way more nefarious. David talks about how you can do that research online, and he actually had a TV show over in Great Britain that followed him, and I think the premise of the TV show was, give us a name and we'll find you in half an hour. And literally they'd throw a group of researchers on the computer, and they would be able to tell where this guy was in Great Britain within half an hour because of his footprint all on public websites, all on public sites and stuff. And so I used those two guys quite a bit, particularly in missing person stuff. People are trying to track down, and when I say missing person, it's not, hey, Frank didn't come home for dinner tonight. It's, I've lost touch with a relative 20 years ago. I'm trying to locate them, typically because somebody in the family's ill and there was a falling out 20 years ago, and we now want to fix everything before before somebody passes away. And I've done probably half a dozen of those, and 4 out of 6 have been successful, and it's been because we've been able to use David and Lori, between the two of them, to find them publicly on the web.
Nice.
I want to add one thing in terms of the mindset of a PI, in terms of that question of weapons, just that I was thinking about, which is, your job as a PI is not to be in confrontation. Your job is to be invisible. And therefore, if you're needing your weapons in real life anyway, which is of course where we take a variance from fiction, your job, my job anyway, was always to get out of the situation. I had a lot of training in counter surveillance, in how to get myself away safely, rather than be in a confrontation. Your goal was always not to be in a confrontation.
And I would follow up on that to say that's exactly right. The other part of that is, here in Canada, you cannot carry a weapon. So carrying a gun, for instance, is absolutely illegal because a handgun's a restricted weapon. And whether I agree with the law or not, that's the way it is. And so if you're writing about a PI in Canada, they're not armed. Now, I know from some colleagues, and I know in certain circumstances over the last 5 or 6 years, I have carried an ASP, which is an expandable baton, but I don't do it regularly. I do it based on what's going on at the moment. And quite frankly, I will probably be carrying one tucked underneath my jacket if this building manager gets released. He is focused. He's shown that he is willing to set someone's house on fire. I wouldn't be surprised if he is, if he's armed. I don't want a confrontation with him. I don't want to be in any confrontation with him. I want to be able to dial 911 on my cell phone and have the police deal with him. But if he is attacking my client, setting her house on fire, it may be, and then I don't fight fair. So that would be the only exception to carrying a weapon, is that I may carry this expandable baton. But in Canada, it's illegal to carry a gun.
I just want to say thank you to Leslie for the last 2 questions. I forgot to give her credit. Getting back to these, and if anyone has more to add, please do add them in the questions. These are terrific. Magnus, what do writers really get wrong that you wish we would get right? So Shoshana and Colin, have you read or watched some sort of PI story and you thought this is completely BS? What's the one thing that totally gives away that someone doesn't know what they're doing?
I'm
going to pass that to Colin.
First of all, I'm reading some questions in the side here, and I just looked up David Toddington. I just did a quick Google search, and you can find him at toddington.com. It's Toddington International, and I use them, and he's a great guy. what do you get wrong? You know, here's the deal, and we talked about this a little bit before we started today. And let me back up a little bit. So my dad worked for IBM. We moved across the country. I ended up in 10 different schools by the time I finished high school. So 12 grades, 10 different schools. I had this wonderful aunt who ended up becoming a librarian, and another aunt that was a nurse that understood just how important reading and writing was. And so my go-to in a new town, even at 7 and 8 years old, was to stick my nose in a book. So a huge thank you to you guys that write and write well, because I've got books from when I was a kid that my aunt gave me for Christmas in 1966 that are still on my bookshelf. I said to Karen a couple of months ago, Karen Dodd, that I was just so honored to be able to talk to a group of writers. So you guys are fantastic, and I know you do wonderful things for kids that have had the opportunity and the exposure to books and to reading. In police work in 27 years, I gravitated towards fantasy because real life stuff was just too weird. No one would believe it. So fantasy was sort of my genre, and I headed that way. And in the last few years, I've picked up Michael Connolly and Louise Penny, and their two characters, Harry Bosch and Armand Gamache, who's the inspector for the Sûreté and stuff. And so I think those guys do it really well because they've got quirky characters. They've got some idiosyncrasies. They've been twisted a little bit by police work. They've got something that's unique to those characters. They write authentically, and Sam, you talked about it earlier. I sort of was leaning towards, hey, you know, there's the police background, but you talked about generations of fiction writers and detective stories that never had police work, but the ones that were successful were quirky. There was some real human characteristics to them that really spoke to people, and so that would be number one, was write authentically about a character. Don't, you know, whatever their experiences are, whatever their background is, write authentically about those personal quirks. I think that's what makes your main character attractive. And then the second thing, if you're going to talk about police work, and again, we talked about this offline, is find yourself a mentor that's a cop, because each police force is unique. Here in Canada, the RCMP is unique, and we have our own subculture, and we look and act in a way that's different from someone that has spent 30 years with Vancouver City Police or the Ontario Provincial Police. You know, there's a different culture, and it's a different way of looking at the world. One of the reasons I love reading Louise Penny's stuff about Gamache is I think it's so typical of the Sûreté in Quebec. They're a weird, you know, they're even in police circles, without fiction writers, like simply in police circles, they're a different cat, right? They have their own unique set of circumstances and the way they look at the world. And I think Louise Penny captures that. So those would be my comments.
Awesome. Shoshana, anything to add to that?
Not really, other than the typical stuff. If you've got somebody doing, you know, investigation, it's, you know, don't have the woman running down the street in high heels, which is something you see more in film than you see in, I mean, it's ridiculous who's actually doing that in real life. But in fiction, that there are some things that, you know, if somebody's doing long surveillance, the reality is a woman, it's really challenging, because if you're not supposed to leave your location, if you're in a vehicle where you're not supposed to leave your location, sometimes you need to pee. And you know, the men that I worked with, they had bottles in the car that they used. Women is not as easy. And so there are those little practicalities, and you start to focus on things like, how much water am I going to be drinking this shift? I need to mitigate so that I can last, you know, this many hours until somebody can come spell me off, or what have you. There's, you know, just those little practicalities that I think is, you know, kind of truthful, fun maybe to put into your fiction.
That's great. And just to add to the high heels, my my partner Carly really liked that Mayor of Easttown show because she said that's the first policewoman I've seen who actually has her hair back.
Mhm.
Like everyone else has the sort of like supermodel locks, and it's like
Full
you're not
makeup,
arresting
yeah.
someone.
Come on.
Question from Laura Ann. Colin, this stalker, he will be released again one day. It sounds like he might return to terrorize this woman again. What is your advice to someone like her to avoid a replay of this nightmare in the future? Change your name, move. What can someone who's being stalked do? I mean, this is such an interesting case that sort of falls between private security, private investigation, and what the law can do.
Yeah, and Sam, that's a really interesting question. I at the end of the day, I don't know. If I'm being a cop, I'd say I don't know. If I'm being a private investigator, I think that you do the mitigation things that you can. And so I've talked to these two clients of mine, and I've talked about, well, number one for her, and I know this goes against it. Like I think my mom was the first female liberation lady. I was peeling carrots and potatoes when I was 7 years old. I was expected to help around the house, and we were expected to do things. And so I know that this goes against the stuff that women control their own destinies and their own bodies. But the very first thing I said to her is, you need to tone down your Instagram posts. You need to stop posting things of you in a bikini on a beach, because that incites the focus of this idiot. And that may be a male response, and I get all that stuff, and I apologize for saying that. And yet, if you start to disappear from somebody's radar, it starts to lessen that. And my experience has told me that. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is understanding what it is. I've raised a daughter and she rolls her eyes until at 27 years old, I overheard her telling her girlfriend, the phrase is situational awareness. So understand what situation you're in. So if I'm in the middle of a Pacific Center shopping center, maybe I'm down, my situational awareness is I'm around a whole bunch of people and I'm less worried about my individual safety. And yet that's, to Shoshona's point, that's when I'm doing some counter surveillance. Somebody could be following me very easily in a very crowded area. And so I'm sort of watching who's hanging around. And it's not just about, it's not just about being out shopping or something like that. But if someone's focused on tracking you, be aware that someone's focused on tracking you at any time. And where are you, and what are you doing, and who's following you, and what situation are you in, and can you go to somebody? Early in my career, we had an incident where a woman was kidnapped, and she'd been held custody for 4 days. She was kidnapped in the Kootenay. She was driven to Horseshoe Bay, and the guy was going to take her to Vancouver Island because that's where he was from. So she is in the back seat of the car. They've been going all night long. There's a massive police hunt for this guy. Everyone knows that he's stolen a car, that he's out there somewhere. No one can find him. She's in the back seat. He tells her to get in the back seat. He's waiting for the ferries to open up at 7 o'clock in the morning. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, she wakes up. So she's exhausted. She's fallen asleep. She's dozed off in the back seat. She wakes up and she says, half an hour to actually sit upright. She doesn't bolt from the car. This is a woman in an extremely stressful situation who was absolutely thinking about her situational awareness. So she didn't bolt from the car at 4 o'clock in the morning. She sat in the back seat and waited and listened to him breathe until 6 o'clock in the morning, when she saw two deckhands from BC Ferry, two great big burly deckhands that had parked their car and were walking to BC Ferries to begin their work. And with that, she bolted out of the back seat, ran screaming to them about what was going on. They kept her safe. And so here's a woman that even in the worst of circumstances is so situationally aware that if she bolted at 4:30 in the morning, he's just going to jump out and grab her and drag her back in. But it's that, and my advice always to clients is, you need to be aware of what's going on. And you may never have been trained that, you may have never thought about that, but the minute that you become focus of anyone's attentions, that's not about love and romance, you need to be situationally aware. You need to understand that your circumstance have changed, and you might wish it to be different, but it's not. And that's the only way you're going to keep yourself safe.
And it's truly amazing how unobservant people are. And I mean, I'm talking 2 decades ago, before people had their phones in their faces. I followed people every single day for almost 10 years, and almost never did somebody notice me. And it's not because I was that good. I mean, I was trained, but it's not because I was that good. It's because people aren't expecting it. And a lot of the times, the people that are situationally aware like that are the ones who are truly aware that they are not doing something that they should be doing, that they're, then they're paying more attention to, elements around them. But people are so unobservant. And, even me in this day and age now, I'm so much less observant than I was 20 years ago when I was out.
Yeah, it's I mean, there really are no great answers for this, but situational awareness, very important. Thank you both for that answer. We have about 25 minutes left. If you do have questions about writing a private eye series, please feel free to add those. But I've got an interesting question from Tom from the Vancouver Film Center. You have both talked about role playing and acting as part of the skill set. I assume you both enjoy PI movies and TV shows. Maybe they even inspired you. Have you learned any tricks or tips from what you have seen on screen or read in novels? Have you ever learned something from a TV show and applied it to your work?
I'm going to guess Colin's going to say no. I'm training. But in my case, I would say that I loved Sue Grafton's Kinsey Mahone series, and that started many years before I became a PI. So I have to say, I think that Kinsey Mahone is maybe one of the reasons I ended up going into the PI business, and then realizing how different it was from what Kinsey Mahone was actually doing. But I don't know that I actually learned anything other than, quarter pounders with cheese are great on stakeouts, and, things like that. But really, honestly, inspiration is one thing. And yeah, I think that was an inspiration for me. But in terms of what I learned it all in my training. I learned it from my colleagues, my superiors, my fellow investigators. It was training.
Yeah, and I will actually disagree with you, Shoshona. Still in the police force. A coworker of mine comes in and flops himself on the seat beside my desk, and I said, "What's wrong?" Because this is a guy that's always upbeat. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I didn't realize just how stupid I was." Oh, he says, "I wish I was 17." And I said, "All right, so why don't we all wish we were 17? Why are you 17? He says, "Because I know everything." He has 2 daughters at home, 2 twin daughters. They're 17 years old. He's like, and I started to laugh and I said, "Yeah, 17-year-olds do know everything." He said, "I didn't realize how stupid I was." And he was in his 40s. And, I like to think, and my daughters would probably, if they were here on the panel, they'd disagree vehemently. But I like to think that I'm open to learning something all the time. And so the problem with being 62 is that I don't remember where I learned it. So you're asking me about film and TV, and I'm certainly that I picked up something, but I don't remember what specifically I did learn from TV or show. But I hope that I guess my whole point is, if you're not learning, if you're not sort of growing and being aware of what's going on, things have changed so much in the last couple of years. We talked about the training that's required to be a PI. You've got to now go to the Justice Institute here in the province of British Columbia. You've got to go through a training period, a formal training period, where before it was just being under supervision. Under supervision is still, I understand, is still part of what's required for your license here. But if you're not open to listening and hearing new experiences, I think you might as well hang up your shingle and really retire.
That's great. I have a couple of questions about writing private investigators from previous time periods, the 1970s and pre-95. Maybe this is not a question that either of you can answer, although I think Shoshana did mention this a bit, but what kind of training would be required back in the day? And do you have any sense of how things have changed? I know Shoshana mentioned that nowadays there's more of a like a post-secondary element to the training of a PI, but anything else that's changed?
There is, and it's funny because I haven't written an actual PI, and one of the reasons is I feel like writing, maybe I should consider doing more of a historical, but writing a modern day PI, I feel like I'm completely out of the loop in terms of the technology that's come along in the past 2 decades that would aid a PI's job. The PI work I did back in, it was really more in the 2000s, but it's amazing the difference. And so, when you're talking about the 90s or even the 70s, it's really back to basics, back to basic investigative work and legwork. And, you just got to take away that, that computer stuff and, little things like, okay, well, we did have video cameras, and I'm sure like nowadays we've got all our cell phones have cameras on them or whatever. Back in those days, that wasn't the case. So I had a video camera that I would put in a purse and plug it in, and there was a little, camera pinhole on the outside of the purse, and I'd carry it and I'd have to point it at whatever I was, trying to get video of. Those are like old-fashioned, it's not that long ago, but old-fashioned things that you would have to do back in those days that today is in some ways kind of easier.
Nice.
Yeah,
And I'll just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Colin.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add to that. I mean, there's no video camera in a purse anymore, because I can sit here like this and I'm texting, and everyone thinks I'm texting, and it's situational awareness again. Everyone thinks I'm texting, and I'm actually filming you. Yeah. And so those things make it easier, and yet it's exactly the same thing that we were doing in 2000. I was talking with some colleagues earlier this week, and we were laughing because several of us started pre-charter. So Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I think that affects lots of things, probably less so detective work or private investigative work, because we're being witnesses. And so, we're not arresting people. We're not doing that sort of stuff. But if there was any sort of major shift in Canada, it's when the charter came into effect.
Nice. That's a great thing for was it 1982?
Yes. 82 or 83, something like that. I've forgotten, but it was a couple of years after I started.
Yeah. And I'll just throw out a plug for 2 great Vancouver history writers, Eve Lazarus and Aaron Chapman, both of whom have written some great true crime and very heavily researched true crime set in BC. They've both worked with ex-VPD officers a lot, so make sure to read their work. Ken, journalist royalty, Ken McQueen. How is your relationship today with the police force, and do they respect your role as a PI?
That one's not for me.
Look, it's about relationship building. It really is, and it's no different than real life. And so, because of the role I played in the story I told you about with this arsonist and the guy that's in jail, I now have again, I have a little bit of celebrity status in North Van with one investigator, and police forces, I think, are just cliquish. So I go and talk to the one guy in North Van. That's great. And if he's talking to his partner, I probably can give him a phone call and talk to him as well. But that started out the first time when I was sort of checking base with both police forces. They're like, Colin, I'd like to talk to you, but I don't know who you are. And one guy said to me, I don't know who you are. You can tell me you're a retired cop and you can tell me you're a PI, but you're on the phone and I don't know who you are and I'm not telling you anything. But now it's progressed and we've done some things together, and now I not only can phone him or not only walk in and see him, but I can phone him and have him say, you know, no one told you this, but you might want to look here, or you might want to do this. And I don't think that's changed from day one, Shoshona. I mean, you worked for probably one of the most famous private investigative firms back in the day, Fred Bodnaruck, who had this huge reputation with the RCMP. And when he retired and he started Fred Bodnaruck Investigations, everybody turned to him, and Fred had an extensive group of friends that he spoke to. And, you know, it's the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And I think that still happens, but you got to work on the relationship. You have to work on the relationship.
Great. Nichelle asks, do most investigators work for a big agency, or are there also a lot of single person agencies?
In my experience, it was at least back in those times, it was more larger agencies. There were several. FBI was probably the biggest one, but there were several others like CamPro that were kind of medium sized and also really well respected. And then there were a couple that I won't name. One of them is still in business, that were like smaller, and you know, the ones that we kind of, the rest of us looked at and went, yeah, they're doing some shady stuff maybe, or you know, we suspect, or maybe they're just whatever, not as good or not as well respected in the community. But I didn't know of anybody who was kind of a one-man operation or a one-woman operation, at least not in Vancouver. I'd imagine maybe if you start to go into some smaller locations, that maybe that would be the case, where you'd have a one person or, you know, several people joining up to make a smaller firm. But I think, Colin, you're kind of doing that, right?
Yeah. It's, you know, it's interesting. I've got sort of a stable of guys that I reach out to if I've got a bigger job or I've got bigger things going on. The other piece for me is I'm involved in sort of the direct security rather than the private investigative stuff. So now as events open up and we're doing more event work, I've got a couple of calls from event people in the last 2 weeks where it looks like events are going again this summer, and so I've had some inquiries about that, and then I'll bring in some people. But I like being the single guy. I like not reporting to anybody but me, and I enjoy not having to manage anybody. So yeah, I'm doing lots of single stuff.
I think those are great answers. This is kind of your last chance to get in questions. I have a couple more to fire out, but if people have questions about the work of a private investigator or writing PI fiction, please ask them now. Lily would like to know, would the police share the same extent of information with the PIs that they did in old times, like how it's shown in classic movies? Well, there's two parts to that, because I don't know that classic movies are a perfect representation of how the police share information with private eyes. But Colin, you talked about how important it was to have relationships and network, but what happens when you hit the limit of what the police can share? And are there ways to get information that's classified if you can't go to the police?
Yeah, you know, you're back interviewing the same people. So police might not be able to, so for instance, so and I was talking to you guys before off camera. So I've got a friend that's still a policeman. He's actively involved in a murder investigation. In a very specific part of the murder investigation, it's a historical murder. He can't and won't, and as part of his professionalism, he's not going to share details with me, and I absolutely respect that. But I also know enough between media reports, historical media reports, and things that are going on, that I know something about the case from the public side of things. And if I wanted to, I'm allowed to, as a private investigator, hell, as your next door neighbor, if someone was involved in something and you want to know about it, you can walk next door and ask them. And so as a private investigator, I can go and ask people. I can figure out what that same case is if I want to put in that legwork, and people will talk to me. So I can go talk to the victim's family. I can go talk to the witnesses. I can do all of that stuff without actually having it shared with the RCMP or the local jurisdiction, whatever that police force is. And that's, you know, I'm not sure who wrote it, but, you know, gumshoe stuff, like that's walking the sidewalks, knocking on the doors and making it happen. And you'd be surprised how people want to talk. If you want to recreate the whole murder investigation, you could probably do it, because people want to talk to you about what's happened and that you've taken an interest. So I don't think we need to rely on, you know, it's a bit of a shortcut. If you've got a friend that says, hey, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you might want to talk to Sam Wiebe about that. That's not sharing information, but it is. And that makes it easier. And that's where the relationship building comes in.
Yeah. And if you've got, I think Colin mentioned, you know, sources and developing relationships with sources. Well, it's not just police that can be excellent sources to get you valid information. You know, when you talk about government workers, ICBC, WCB, they have enormous databases at their disposal that, you know, and this is, you know, not naming names, but, you know, if you have your character have a friend who works at ICBC and they're willing to share information, they can look up people's addresses, license plates, vehicles, like all of these things, these pieces of data that you can access by just having good contacts within different corporations.
Yeah,
that's great information. We have a question from Michelle about what do you look for when you have to hire part-time or temporary help? Do you have a pool of people you contact, or do you advertise, or what? And Shoshana, if you'd like to answer this too, if you were in on the hiring process at all, what do you look for when you have to hire a private investigator?
Okay, so I'll say I certainly wasn't involved in the hiring, but what I can say is, at least in the company I worked for, it was a large company, and most of the people in the company were ex-cops. And so they were very knowledgeable and very well versed, and had lots of excellent contacts that they could use to work their investigations. And I suspect at a certain point what they did was said, we need to hire the grunts on the ground who don't look like they're ex-cops, because we need to be able to, you know, there was some fantastic investigators that I worked with who, you know, had decades of experience and would be saying to me, I can't go in there. I walk in and I'm like, I'm obviously an ex-cop. I can't go in there. And so they'd have to send in me or the other female investigator I worked with, or there were a couple of other younger guys who just kind of looked, you know, a little bit more like your average Joe, who could go in there. So I suspect that that's what they were looking for, but I certainly wasn't hiring anybody myself.
And I've got a well, I don't say a parade of guys, but I've got a number of guys, even 13 years after police work, I've got a number of guys that will phone me or drop me a line on Facebook or say, hey, do you got any work? Because guys are retired and they go, I've played golf 5 times this week. I don't want to play golf 5 times next week. And so they're looking for work. And so I have to Shoshona's point, I've got a sort of a constant people, guys reaching out, men and women reaching out saying, do you have any work that I can do? And it's always easier to hire someone that has experience, that understands surveillance, that understands investigating and all that sort of stuff. And so from time to time, I bring somebody on, but it really is project based, and it lasts a week or it lasts a month and then it's done. So.
There's a question from Rita, and Crystal has sort of asked a variation of this too, about sharing information the other way with the police or the authorities. If you come across something police need to know, would you reach out? Would you ever do this anonymously, or do you go through formal channels? And if you find information, do you share with the police?
My history is police work, so simple answer for me is yes. And if I can do it without compromising anybody, then I'll do it formally, and I'll do it as part of the relationship building stuff. So I'll pick up the phone and say, hey, here's who I am. I came across some information you might be interested in, and here's why I think it's important. So yes, and I'll write a statement. So, you know, following this guy and getting him arrested by Vancouver City Police, they were going on some good faith stuff that this guy was part of it. But I sat down, and Shoshona, you really, you know, I think you highlighted it a few minutes ago when you said, I'm getting called into cases that I don't even remember, but thank God I had good notes and I wrote a report, and there's stuff that you can rely on. And that's no different than police work, is that if you're going to do this work, if you're going to do private investigative work, you've got to take great notes. You've got to be able to say a year or 2 or 10 from now, this is what I did on this day at this time, and here's why. And do I share that? Every opportunity I get, because it helps build that relationship of a back and forth. I'm not knocking on the door every day saying, hey, give me what you got. I'm saying, here's what I can give you, and here's what I learned, and here's what's happening, and here's my statement, so that you can build your case. I mean, I'd like it most of all if this guy gets convicted and does the next 5 years in jail. It makes my job protecting my clients a whole lot easier if he's in the slammer for 5 years, right?
And yeah, we did as well. It would depend on the circumstances, because we were always beholden to whatever client was paying our bills as well. So if there was one case I worked where I was following a guy, and he was doing some stuff that started to make me think he's watching children. And there was a moment where I was getting really uncomfortable with what he was doing, and I thought there was an immediate concern. And in that case, I called 911 like right away. In other circumstances where there was something else nefarious going on that we thought was a legal issue, but it wasn't like an immediate danger, we would contact our client first and let them know, hey, this is going on, just so you know, we are going to be notifying the RCMP or the police or whatever. But we're giving you the heads up first, because it wasn't an emergency circumstance. But yeah, always.
That's terrific. Again, not terrific what happened. That's the information. I have 2 last questions. One is from Karen Dodd, our one of our organizers. Could you ask if a British Columbia private investigator can follow a case across borders, across the province, internationally? How do you work with a case that takes you out of BC?
We had a couple, I certainly had cases where I'd start off the morning thinking, I'm going to go check this person, see what they're doing this morning, see if they're going to work. And the next thing I know, I'm following them onto a ferry or up into the Okanagan or something like that. But because of where we live, I didn't ever have a situation where it got to be like inter-province or what have you. If somebody was getting on an airplane, we just basically would let them go. In that case, because our clients weren't about to pay for us to take a flight, and all the hours that we were going to spend, it wasn't worth it. But I seem to recall there was something. Certainly, if somebody went to the border, we see you, you know, they headed to the border, they're going into Blaine, and that's it, right? I don't know if we would have been allowed to follow into a different province. That never came up. Colin, you might have a better understanding of that.
Yeah, I've never had a client. Oh, actually, what really sort of launched my career here in Vancouver was a client of mine that I do a bunch of work for here in Vancouver also has a residence in Phoenix. And he asked me to follow it up. And it was something that was going on in Phoenix. And so he paid for me to fly down to Phoenix. So I spent a week in Phoenix. I talked to the police department. The first thing I did actually was talk to the law firm that had been hired by my client. And so I talked to them about what had happened in British Columbia and what was available in British Columbia and why we thought there was a concern here in Phoenix. And so it really went a civil route. And I used the law firm as the people to reach out to the police department, people to reach out to the authorities that needed to know. Another client this past fall was actually international into Europe. And so the information that we had got through the law firm, I made sure that Canadian Border Services knew, and then sort of washed my hands of it. I said, this is important. Here's why it's important. These are the things that we think might happen internationally. But now you guys have the package that we can share to CBSA. And I hope you guys will have a relationship with the other authorities that need to know about this. So the receiving country, you guys can share this information. We can share it here publicly. I'm certain that, you know, every 3-letter agency or 4-letter agency here in Canada or the United States has a liaison position. They have a counterpart that they work with and that they talk to relatively regularly. And so if you can share information with them, you can guarantee that it's at least going to get to the next jurisdiction, even though you might not follow up with it personally.
Last question is from Lori. This is just about event security. How do you provide bodies for security if they can't be armed?
That's a question for Colin too.
You know what? It really starts back with the situational awareness stuff. And so, you know, I've provided security as a private investigator, security consultant. I've provided security for a number of private individuals. Probably our most famous is the Dalai Lama. When he was in town, we spent 2 days with him. The Dalai Lama has this wonderful reputation and everyone wants to see him. We're not so much worried about the nefarious side of things, but we also don't want him to get mobbed. So it's really about providing a walking barrier for him, and people get it, right? I put 4 guys in suit and tie with earpieces in. Everybody understands who we are and what our role is. And certainly here in Canada, people respect that to a large part. But I look at our most recent event, and Dave Chappelle was just attacked in the Hollywood Bowl night before last by somebody that got up out of the audience and ran across the stage. His security should be fired. They should be fired. Dead simple. Nobody should ever get to your principal, and to have that much of a head start, somebody's not paying attention. And so. In the States, I'm surprised actually he didn't get shot, but because you can be armed, you can carry a gun down in the States. But here in Canada, I can stand in the wings at a rock concert and watch. I'm not listening to the music. I'm not watching what's going on stage. I'm watching what's happening in the front row. And when someone reaches their hand up to that stage to start to climb on the stage, my guys are there, or I am there to prevent that from happening, or to assist him up and right onto his belly so that I can drag him off stage before he gets to the principal. That's my job. And so for somebody to get up on the stage and attack Dave Chappelle the way that happened, that security company should be fired. It's that simple. That's inexcusable. And so here in Canada, we have that ability to physically intervene, and the guys that I hire are all comfortable in physically intervening. But 99% of the time, it's simply about saying, please step back, holding up your hand with a stop sign. Please step back. Please give us a little bit of room, being polite, being straightforward, and then working with your client to make sure that they understand what's required of them and how you move people through crowds or protect them at a scene. 99.9% of the time, I don't need a weapon to do that. I just need some smarts and some situational awareness.
That's a perfect callback. Thank you so much, Colin Worth from Cornerstone Protection Agency. Thank you, S.M. Freedman, whose new book, Blood Atonement, comes out soon. And thank you to the Sisters in Crime for organizing this. And if you enjoyed this event, please join the chapter at sinc-cw.ca/upcoming/event. Sorry, the chat is moving on me. But please check out the website. My name is Sam Wiebe, and I feel so excited to get back to writing PI fiction now that I've done this. That was so much great information. Thank you, everyone, and happy writing.
Sam, thank you so much. Oh my gosh. And again, I want to thank the panelists, Shoshona and Colin. I from my perspective, I just feel like our panelists and you, Sam, put such a you shared so much of the emotional side of the business, our panelists, and Sam, you did such a great job of bringing that out. And it just, to me, it put such a human face on both the policing and the PI business. And I know I've been guilty of writing a PI in very one-dimensional, very cardboard. And to me, this has just, Colin and Shoshona, you've really helped us see these people as very complex, three-dimensional people with such different backgrounds. And so I know going forward in my writing, it will help tremendously. So thank you for that. And Sam, for your insightful questions and bringing all those things out. Finally, I see many members of our chapter on the list of attendees today, but also a lot of our guests. And so those of you who are not yet members of Canada West, Sisters in Crime, Charlotte and I have been blasting you with our website. And so I would encourage you to join our chapter. We've posted the links there for you. Of course, you do have to be a member of Sisters in Crime National to be a chapter member, but honestly, I can say this as a member of a number of years and not just on the executive. It's just been such huge value to me. And like, where else would we get access to these kind of experts and people and writers? And so again, I just want to thank everyone so much for being here. Again, to our panelists, I could listen to you all day, even on a Saturday. And so, and Charlotte, thank you for all your hard work behind the scenes.
Great.
So, all right. Thanks, everyone. It's a wrap.
Hi.
Before everyone runs, I just want to reiterate, writers saved my life as a kid. I love being associated with writers. And I want to say thank you to you guys for reaching out and giving me this opportunity. I mean, it was a delight to meet the people I see on the screen, Karen, Shoshona, Sam, Charlotte. Thank you so much for making this so easy. But the opportunity, I just feel so honored. So thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, hope you come back.
Yes, I know where to find you.
Thanks very much, everyone. We'll say goodbye to the audience now and see you in the fall for one of our next events. Bye.